At the edge of a forgotten highway, where the wind carried only dust and broken promises, Kim stood clutching the single thing the orphanage director had given her on her 18th birthday. It was not an explanation, not a photograph, not even a letter. It was a rusted key attached to a grease-stained tag that read, Rosie's Diner, Highway 41, for 18 years, Street. Mary's had told her the same story. She had been abandoned as an infant, left on the steps with nothing, no family, no past, no one who ever wanted her. But the diner she now owned had been condemned and abandoned for over 20 years, its dark windows like empty eyes staring at the road. Kim had passed it countless times during her lonely childhood walks, never knowing it held her name. Why would someone leave her the key to a derelict building instead of the truth? What secret had been waiting all these years behind those boarded-up doors? And who was Rosie? The office of Mrs. Patricia Henshaw, director of Street. Mary's orphanage smelled of old paper, lemon furniture polish, and the faint, stale breath of air that had circulated through the same yellowed walls for 30 years. Kim sat in the worn wooden chair that faced the heavy oak desk, her small frame nearly swallowed by the institutional shadows of the room, her 18th birthday passing as unremarkably as every birthday before it. She wore the same clothes she always wore, a faded gray hoodie over a simple white t-shirt and jeans that had been donated by someone who had outgrown them. And at her feet sat a backpack containing everything she owned in the world, 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a cheap paperback novel with a cracked spine, and $47 she had saved from working weekend shifts at the grocery store. Mrs. Henshaw sat across from her, a woman in her late 50s with a face like carved stone, her thin lips pressed into a line that Kim had learned long ago meant the conversation would be brief and devoid of comfort. The news was delivered with the same clinical efficiency as every other piece of bad news Kim had received in this room over the years. There was no family, no relatives who had ever come forward, no one who had ever called or written or asked about the baby girl left on the orphanage steps 18 years ago, wrapped in a thin pink blanket with no note, no name, no explanation. Kim had known this, of course, had always known it, had spent her entire childhood watching other children leave with smiling parents while she remained, a permanent fixture in the halls of Street, Mary's like the chipped paint and the flickering fluorescent lights. She nodded, her expression carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap to hide the way they trembled, and she prepared to stand, to walk out into the cold March morning and begin whatever came next. But then Mrs. Henshaw did something unexpected. She reached into the top drawer of her desk, her movements stiff and mechanical, and produced a small manila envelope that looked as though it had been sitting in that drawer for a very long time, its edges yellowed and curled. From the envelope, she withdrew a single rusted key attached to a grease-stained paper tag by a loop of dirty string, and she placed it on the desk between them with a soft metallic click that seemed too loud in the suffocating silence of the office. Kim stared at the key, at the rust that had eaten into its teeth, at the tag that read in faded handwriting, Rosie's Diner, Highway 41, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Mrs. Henshaw cleared her throat, a dry, rattling sound, and explained in a voice that wavered just slightly that the diner had been left to Kim by someone, that it was legally hers now, that the property had been abandoned and condemned for over 20 years, that it was worth nothing, that she should probably just sell it for scrap if she could find anyone willing to take it. But there was something in the director's eyes as she spoke, something that looked almost like fear, a quick darting glance toward the door as if she expected someone to burst through at any moment. Kim reached out slowly and picked up the key, feeling its weight in her palm, cold and solid and impossibly heavy for something so small, and she looked up at Mrs. Henshaw and asked the only question that mattered, "Who left this to me?" The director's face went pale, and she said in a whisper so quiet Kim almost missed it, "I don't know, and I don't want to know, and neither should you." Kim left Street Mary's orphanage with the rusted key clutched in her fist and her backpack slung over one shoulder, walking down the familiar cracked sidewalk that led away from the only home she had ever known. Each step taking her deeper into a future that felt as empty and uncertain as the cold March sky overhead. The town of Millbrook stretched out before her in all its worn, faded glory, a collection of buildings that had seen better days, their windows reflecting nothing but gray clouds and the ghosts of prosperity long since departed. She knew exactly where Highway 41 was because she had passed it countless times during the orphanage's supervised outings, those rare Sunday afternoons when Mrs. Henshaw would load the younger children into the van and drive them to the park or the library, and Kim, being one of the oldest, would sit in the back and stare out the window at the world that existed beyond the iron fence of Street Mary's. She had always noticed the diner, a low, long building that sat like a forgotten monument at the edge of town, where the residential streets gave way to open highway. Its presence so desolate and haunting that even as a child she had wondered what stories it held, what lives had passed through its doors before it became just another casualty of time and neglect. The walk took nearly 2 hours, her feet carrying her along the shoulder of the road as cars rushed past, their drivers never glancing at the thin young woman with the backpack who looked like just another piece of human debris blowing through their town. When she finally reached the diner, the reality of it hit her like a physical blow, far worse than the distant glimpses from a moving van had ever suggested. The building was a corpse, plain and simple, its wooden walls bleached gray by decades of sun and rain, its windows boarded over with plywood that had warped and split, and its roof sagging in the middle as if the structure itself was tired of standing. The sign that had once spelled out Rosie's Diner in cheerful red letters now hung from a single rusted chain, the letters faded to a dull pink, swaying slightly in the cold wind that swept across the empty parking lot. The asphalt of that lot was a spider web of cracks, each fissure filled with dirt and sprouting stubborn weeds that pushed their way toward the pale sunlight. And the whole place had an air of such profound abandonment that Kim felt a crushing weight settle on her shoulders as she stood there, key in hand, staring at the inheritance that someone had thought she deserved. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the building, her boots crunching on broken glass and loose gravel, and that was when she heard it, a soft, pitiful whimpering coming from behind the diner where a rusted dumpster sat surrounded by tall brown grass. She pushed through the weeds and found the dog, a German shepherd mix with a coat of matted gray and tan fur, so thin that every rib was visible beneath its skin, chained to a metal post with a heavy chain that had rubbed its neck raw and bleeding. The dog looked up at her with eyes that held no hope, only a dull, exhausted acceptance of its fate. And Kim felt something crack open inside her chest, a fury so pure and hot that it burned away the fog of her own despair. She knelt beside the dog, speaking softly, her hands gentle as she examined the cruel chain, and the animal, sensing kindness perhaps for the first time in weeks, licked her hand with a dry, cracked tongue. Kim used the last of her money, the $47 that was supposed to feed her for the next week, and walked to the gas station 2 blocks away, buying 3 cans of dog food, a plastic bowl, and a bottle of water. She returned to the diner, broke open the cans with the key that was supposed to unlock her future, and watched as the dog ate with desperate, gulping hunger, tears streaming down her face for this broken creature that someone had discarded as carelessly as they had discarded her. She named the dog Mercy, because mercy was what they both needed, and she vowed that whatever came next, they would face it together. After Mercy had eaten and drunk her fill, Kim used a sharp rock to work at the chain that bound her to the post, the old metal finally giving way with a screech of protest. And together they approached the front door of the diner, Kim's hands shaking as she fitted the rusted key into the lock that had not been turned in over 20 years. The mechanism resisted at first, frozen by time and corrosion, but she pressed her shoulder against the scarred wooden door and turned with all her strength until something inside gave way with a deep, groaning click that echoed in the empty parking lot like the opening of a tomb. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled of dust, old grease, and the peculiar scent of time itself, that indescribable odor of years passing in darkness and silence. Kim stepped across the threshold with Mercy close at her heels, and what she found inside stole the breath from her lungs because it was not the gutted ruin she had expected, not the vandalized shell that abandonment usually created, but a perfect frozen moment, a snapshot of a world that had simply stopped existing one day and never started again. The interior was a time capsule from the late 1990 seconds, every surface covered in a thick blanket of gray dust that muffled her footsteps and turned the weak afternoon light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows into something dreamlike and surreal. There were 6 booths along the left wall, their vinyl seats cracked and faded from red to a dull rust color, the stuffing visible through splits in the fabric like exposed wounds, and a long formica counter stretched along the right side of the room, lined with chrome stools whose seats had dimpled with the weight of thousands of customers who would never return. In the far corner sat a jukebox, its curved glass front clouded with dust but still displaying the colorful selection cards behind it, promising songs from an era when this place had been alive with voices and laughter and the sizzle of food on a griddle. Behind the counter, Kim could see through the pass-through window into the kitchen, where industrial stoves and a flat-top grill sat like monuments to a vanished purpose, their surfaces dulled by neglect but unmarred by the graffiti and destruction that usually accompanied abandonment. That was what struck her most powerfully, the absence of violation, the sense that this place had not been destroyed but simply locked away, preserved like a photograph in an album that no one ever opened. She moved slowly through the dining room, her fingers trailing through the dust on the counter, leaving clean tracks in the gray powder, and she found a stack of old menus tucked beneath the register, their laminated covers sticky with age. The prices seemed impossibly low, a glimpse into an economy from another lifetime, and the descriptions were simple and honest: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, apple pie, coffee. Beside the register, she discovered a small cardboard box filled with receipts, the topmost ones dated August 2003, the ink faded but still legible, recording the mundane transactions of the diner's final days. But it was the framed newspaper clipping on the wall behind the counter that stopped her cold, that made her knees weak and her heart pound with a confusion of emotions she could not name. The photograph showed a woman in her 40s standing in front of this very diner when it had been vibrant and welcoming, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face lit with a genuine smile that reached her eyes, wearing a checkered apron and holding a coffee pot in one hand. The caption beneath read, "Rosie Chen, local businesswoman, celebrates 25 years of serving Millbrook." Kim lifted the frame from its hook with trembling hands, wiping the dust from the glass with her sleeve, and she stared at the woman's face with an intensity that made her vision blur, searching desperately for some connection, some recognition, some hint of resemblance in the shape of the eyes or the curve of the mouth. The woman had Asian features, high cheekbones, and a strength in her expression that spoke of determination and kindness in equal measure. And Kim, who had never known her own face's origins, who had spent 18 years wondering where she had come from, felt something shift deep inside her, a possibility too frightening and too hopeful to name. Kim spent that first night in the diner with Mercy curled beside her on the cracked vinyl of a booth, using her backpack as a pillow and her hoodie as a blanket, sleeping fitfully as the old building creaked and settled around them like the bones of some great beast. When morning came, gray and cold through the gaps in the boarded windows, she knew she needed supplies if she was going to make this place even minimally habitable, needed food and water and cleaning materials, and something to secure the doors properly, because the rusted lock would not keep out anyone who really wanted to get inside. She left Mercy with a bowl of water and a promise to return quickly, then walked the 1.5 miles into the center of Millbrook, a town that looked even more worn and tired in the harsh morning light than it had from the windows of the orphanage van. The main street was a collection of brick buildings from another era, their facades crumbling, their windows displaying goods that seemed perpetually on sale, and the few people she passed on the sidewalk moved with the slow, defeated shuffle of those who had long ago given up on the idea that anything would ever change. She found Miller's hardware store wedged between a closed-down pharmacy and a laundromat, its windows cluttered with displays of tools and paint cans, and she pushed through the door into a space that smelled of sawdust, metal, and old men's aftershave. The elderly cashier behind the counter looked up from his newspaper as she entered, his rimy eyes assessing her with the casual suspicion that small towns reserved for strangers. And Kim moved through the narrow aisles, gathering the cheapest versions of what she needed: a padlock, a broom, a package of cleaning rags, a gallon of water, and a box of granola bars. When she brought her meager purchases to the counter, the cashier rang them up with mechanical efficiency, his gnarled fingers punching the old register keys, and she said, trying to make conversation, trying to sound like someone who belonged, "I'm the new owner of Rosie's Diner out on Highway 41, just starting to fix it up." The effect of her words was immediate and profound, as if she had detonated a small bomb in the quiet store. The cashier's face went pale, the color draining from his weathered cheeks, and his hands froze over the register, and the 2 other customers in the store, middle-aged men who had been examining a display of wrenches, stopped their conversation mid-sentence and turned to stare at her with expressions that mixed shock and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and Kim felt her skin prickle with unease as she realized she had said something terribly wrong, had violated some unspoken rule of this place. The cashier finished the transaction without meeting her eyes. His movements hurried now, almost panicked, and he shoved her change across the counter and turned away before she could thank him. Kim gathered her supplies and fled the store, her heart pounding, and she had barely made it to the sidewalk when she heard a voice behind her, low and urgent, calling out, "Miss." Wait. She turned to find an old man, thin as a rail and bent with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles beneath a faded blue cap, standing a few feet away and glancing nervously up and down the street as if checking for observers. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell tobacco and peppermint on his breath, and he said in a whisper that barely carried over the sound of the wind, "That place should stay closed, you hear me?" Rosie asked too many questions, and look what happened to her. Kim felt ice water flood her veins, and she opened her mouth to demand an explanation, to ask what he meant, what questions. What happened? But before she could form the words, the old man's eyes widened in alarm as a black SUV with tinted windows appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly, deliberately, its presence as out of place in this shabby town as a shark in a bathtub. The old man, whose name she would later learn was Frank, backed away from her quickly, shaking his head, and he disappeared into the alley between the buildings before the SUV reached them. Leaving Kim standing alone on the sidewalk, her supplies clutched to her chest, watching as the vehicle rolled past with a predatory slowness, its dark windows reflecting nothing but her own pale, frightened face. Kim hurried back to the diner with her supplies, her mind churning over Frank's cryptic warning and the ominous presence of the black SUV. And when she pushed through the door, Mercy greeted her with unusual agitation, pacing in tight circles and letting out soft, anxious whines that were so unlike the dog's grateful, gentle demeanor from the night before. Kim set down her bags and knelt beside Mercy, running her hands over the dog's thin frame, checking for injury or illness, but found nothing wrong, and yet the animal's distress only intensified, her amber eyes fixed on the doorway that led to the kitchen area behind the counter. Mercy moved toward that doorway, stopped, looked back at Kim, and whined again, a sound of desperate urgency that seemed to communicate something beyond simple need or fear. Kim followed, her unease growing, and Mercy led her through the kitchen with its dusty appliances and cobwebbed corners, past the industrial stoves and the empty storage shelves, to the far back corner where a massive walk-in freezer sat like a steel sarcophagus, its door sealed with rust and time. But Mercy was not interested in the freezer itself. Instead, she was fixated on a section of the grimy linoleum floor just to its left, pawing at it with increasing franticness, her claws scratching against the tiles, her whining escalating to sharp, insistent barks that echoed in the empty kitchen. Kim knelt on the cold floor and examined the area, seeing nothing unusual at first, just the same cracked and stained tiles that covered the rest of the space. But when she pressed down on the section Mercy had been pawing, she felt it give slightly, felt a subtle movement that should not have been there. She used the edge of a metal spatula she found hanging on the wall to pry at the grout lines, and after several minutes of careful work, she managed to lift one of the tiles, revealing not the concrete foundation she expected, but a small, recessed metal handle, tarnished but solid, attached to something beneath. Her heart hammering in her chest, Kim gripped the handle with both hands and pulled, and with a grinding screech of metal on metal, a section of the floor approximately 3 feet square began to lift, hinged on one side, revealing a narrow staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cold and stale, carrying with it the smell of concrete and old paper, and Kim sat back on her heels, staring into the black rectangle, her mind reeling with questions and a fear she could not quite name. Mercy pressed against her side, no longer whining but alert and focused, and Kim pulled out her phone, activated its flashlight, and aimed the weak beam down into the hidden space. The stairs were steep and narrow, made of wood that looked surprisingly solid despite the years, and they led down perhaps 10 feet into what appeared to be a small room carved out beneath the diner's foundation. Taking a deep breath and silently praying that the stairs would hold her weight, Kim descended with Mercy close behind, her phone's light casting wild shadows on the earthen walls. At the bottom, she found herself in a space no larger than a walk-in closet, its walls lined with plastic sheeting to keep out moisture, and what she saw there made her forget to breathe, made the entire world narrow to the cone of light from her phone, and the impossible reality it illuminated. Against one wall stood a metal desk and chair, both old but functional, and above the desk was a large corkboard bulletin board mounted to the plastic sheeting. The board was covered, every square inch of it, with photographs pinned in clusters, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, handwritten notes in a cramped, urgent script, and lengths of red string connecting various pieces in a complex web that spoke of obsession and investigation and a mind trying desperately to make sense of a pattern. Along another wall stood 2 tall filing cabinets, their metal surfaces dulled, but their drawers labeled with careful precision: water samples, medical records, testimonies, financial documents. Kim moved closer to the bulletin board, her hands shaking as she held up her phone, and she saw photographs of children, dozens of them, school pictures with innocent smiles, and beside many of them were newspaper obituaries, death notices for kids who should have grown old, and in the center of it all was a photograph of a large industrial building with tall smokestacks, and beneath it, written in angry red marker, were the words, "Clearwater Industries, they're poisoning us, they're killing our children, and someone has to stop them." Kim lost all sense of time in that hidden room beneath the diner, sitting at Rosie's old desk with Mercy curled at her feet, pulling file after file from the cabinets and reading by the light of her phone, which she had to keep plugging into a surprisingly functional outlet that suggested someone had intended this space to be used for extended periods. The picture that emerged from those meticulously organized documents was not just disturbing but horrifying, a chronicle of suffering and death that had been unfolding in Millbrook for decades while the world above remained willfully blind. Rosie Chen, the smiling woman from the newspaper clipping, had been far more than a simple diner owner serving coffee and pie to her neighbors. She had been a woman with a fierce sense of justice and a refusal to accept convenient lies, and according to her own handwritten notes dated from 1997 onward, she had begun to notice a pattern that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Children in Millbrook were getting sick at rates that defied statistical probability, diagnosed with rare cancers and aggressive respiratory diseases that usually struck only a handful of people per million. Yet in this town of fewer than 5,000 souls, there had been 23 cases in just 6 years. Rosie had started her investigation quietly, simply asking questions of the parents who came into her diner, parents whose faces were hollow with grief and exhaustion, and she had compiled a list of names, ages, diagnoses, and addresses, mapping them out on a hand-drawn chart that showed a clear geographical cluster. The children who were getting sick all lived in the same section of town, the eastern quadrant where the houses were oldest and poorest, where the creek that ran down from the hills passed through on its way to the river, and where the property values had been declining steadily since the early 1992s. That creek, Rosie had noted in her journal, flowed directly past Clearwater Industries, a chemical manufacturing plant that had opened in 1989 and had brought jobs and prosperity to Millbrook in those first golden years, becoming the town's largest employer and the source of funding for everything from the new high school gymnasium to the annual 4th of July celebration. But Rosie had not been satisfied with correlation. She had wanted proof, and the water samples folder contained laboratory reports from an independent testing facility in another state, reports that showed catastrophic levels of industrial solvents, heavy metals including lead and mercury, and a dozen carcinogenic compounds in water taken from the creek and from the wells of affected families. The medical records folder was even more damning, filled with copies of hospital files that Rosie had obtained through connections with sympathetic nurses and doctors, each one documenting the progression of diseases that had no business existing in children, tumors that grew with unnatural aggression, lungs that failed before they had finished developing, immune systems that collapsed as if poisoned from within. The testimonies were the hardest to read, handwritten accounts from mothers and fathers describing their children's suffering, their frustration with doctors who had no answers, their growing suspicion that something in their town was deeply, terribly wrong, and their gratitude that someone, finally, was listening and taking them seriously. Rosie had been planning to take all of this evidence to the Environmental Protection Agency to force an investigation that could not be ignored, and her journal entries from the summer of 2003 were filled with a mixture of hope and fear, describing threatening phone calls she had received, strange cars that followed her, and a sense that time was running out. The final entry was dated the 14th of August 2003, and it read simply, "Tomorrow I drive to the state capitol. Tomorrow I tell the truth. Tomorrow everything changes, and if I don't make it back, I pray someone finds this and finishes what I started." Kim had been reading for hours, her eyes burning from the strain of focusing on faded text in the inadequate light, her mind reeling from the magnitude of what Rosie had uncovered. When she reached for the last folder in the bottom drawer of the second filing cabinet, a plain manila folder labeled simply "Personal," in that same careful handwriting that had documented so much suffering. Her hands were trembling as she opened it, expecting perhaps insurance documents or tax records, but instead she found a birth certificate, official and sealed, the paper still crisp despite the years. And when her eyes focused on the name printed there, the world seemed to tilt sideways, and all the air left her lungs in a rush. The certificate read, Kim Chen, born the 15th of March 2006, Millbrook County Hospital, mother Rosie Chen, father unknown. She stared at her own name, at the date that matched her birthday exactly, at the mother's name that connected her to the woman in the photograph upstairs, and her mind simply could not process what she was seeing, could not reconcile the impossible truth that was written in black ink on official paper. Attached to the birth certificate with a rusted paperclip was a letter, 3 pages of lined notebook paper covered in handwriting that was shakier and less controlled than the notes in the investigation files, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling with emotion or fear. The letter was dated February 2006, and it began with words that broke something fundamental inside Kim's chest. My darling daughter, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And they've won for now, but you're alive, and that means there's still hope. Kim sank to the cold concrete floor, her back against the filing cabinet, and she read through tears that blurred the words and made her have to stop and wipe her eyes every few sentences. Rosie wrote about discovering she was pregnant in late 2005, 2 years after her planned trip to the state capital had been prevented by what she called an accident that wasn't an accident, an event that had left her hospitalized and terrified and aware that Clearwater Industries and the people they controlled would stop at nothing to silence her. She wrote about the impossible choice she faced, about wanting desperately to keep her baby but knowing that as long as the child was connected to her, that child would be a target, a piece of leverage that could be used to ensure Rosie's continued silence. She wrote about the decision to place Kim somewhere safe, somewhere anonymous, somewhere the people who were watching would never think to look, and she apologized over and over. The word "forgive me" appearing like a mantra throughout the letter, a prayer written to a daughter who might never understand why her mother had given her away. But it was the final paragraph that seared itself into Kim's memory, that transformed her grief and confusion into something harder and more focused. If you've found this, if you're old enough to read these words, then you've also found my investigation, my life's work, the truth that I died trying to tell. I'm asking you to finish what I started. The evidence is all here, the proof is undeniable, and someone has to make them answer for what they've done. Find Dr. Ellen Marsh at County General Hospital. She's the only person I trusted, the only one who believed me from the beginning. Trust no one else, not the police, not the mayor, no one in Millbrook's power structure, because they're all compromised. You're my daughter, you have my blood, my strength, my stubbornness, and I believe that if anyone can bring justice to this town, it's you. I'm so sorry I couldn't raise you, couldn't watch you grow, couldn't be there for your first words and your first steps and all the moments a mother should never miss. But I loved you from the moment I knew you existed, and I'm protecting you the only way I know how. Please, my beautiful girl, please finish this. Make them pay for what they've done to our town's children. I love you always, Mom. Kim spent the rest of that day in a daze, moving through the diner like a ghost, her mind unable to fully process the truth that Rosie Chen had been her mother, that every moment of her abandoned childhood had been a sacrifice made to keep her alive, and that she now carried the weight of a murdered woman's final wish. She found a small back office behind the kitchen, a cramped space with a window that looked out over the weedy lot and the woods beyond, and she spent hours cleaning it, scrubbing away years of dust and mouse droppings, as if the physical labor could somehow organize the chaos in her head. There was an old couch pushed against one wall, its upholstery stained and torn, but after she beat the dust from it and covered it with the clean blanket she had bought in town, it became something close to a bed, the first real bed she had chosen for herself in her entire life. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, she ate a granola bar and shared another can of dog food with Mercy, and then she lay down on that couch with her jacket as a pillow, staring at the ceiling and listening to the building settle around her, trying to imagine what Rosie had felt in those final days, carrying a child and carrying the truth, and knowing that both would make her a target. She must have fallen asleep despite her racing thoughts, because she was jolted awake by Mercy's barking, not the friendly greeting bark or the attention-seeking bark, but a deep, aggressive alarm that spoke of genuine threat. Kim sat up, her heart already pounding, and she saw Mercy standing rigid at the window, hackles raised, teeth bared, staring out into the darkness with an intensity that made Kim's skin prickle with fear. She moved to the window and peered through the grimy glass, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Two figures, dark shapes against the deeper darkness of the night, were at the back door of the diner. One of them working at the handle with some kind of tool while the other stood watch, their faces obscured by hoods and shadows. Kim's military response was immediate and automatic. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and reported the attempted break-in with as much calm as she could muster, giving the address and describing what she was seeing. And when the dispatcher asked if she was safe, Kim said she had locked herself in the office with her dog and would not come out until police arrived. The two figures must have heard Mercy's continued barking or seen a light go on inside, because they abandoned their attempt and melted back into the darkness, disappearing into the woods before Kim heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. The police arrived 15 minutes later, and Kim, with Mercy pressed protectively against her leg, opened the front door to find Sheriff Tom Bridger himself standing on the threshold. A large man in his 50s, with a weathered face and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was friendly in his manner, almost folksy, asking if she was all right and assuring her that this kind of thing happened sometimes in abandoned buildings, probably just vandals or homeless folks looking for a place to get out of the cold. But Kim noticed, even through her residual fear and adrenaline, that Sheriff Bridger spent far more time looking around the interior of the diner than examining the scratches on the back door lock, his gaze lingering on the kitchen entrance, the bulletin board on the wall, the doorway that led to the office. He asked questions that seemed casual but weren't. How long was she planning to stay? Did she have family in the area? Had she found anything interesting in the old place? Kim answered carefully, revealing nothing, and when the sheriff finally left, he paused at the door and said with that same smile that never reached his eyes, "Might be safer if you just sold this place. Miss, I know some developers who'd give you a fair price, save you a lot of trouble." Kim barely slept after the sheriff's visit, lying awake with Mercy curled beside her, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle she was now committed to solving. When dawn finally broke gray and cold through the window, she knew what she had to do. Knew that the letter from her mother had given her a starting point, a name that represented the only person Rosie had trusted in this poisoned town. County General Hospital was a 40-minute walk from the diner, a sprawling brick complex on the northern edge of Millbrook that served 3 rural counties, and Kim arrived just after 9 in the morning, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, her face drawn with exhaustion and determination. At the information desk she asked for Dr. Ellen Marsh, and the volunteer, an elderly woman with kind eyes, checked her computer and said that Dr. Marsh was in pediatrics on the 3rd floor, currently doing rounds but usually available in her office by early afternoon. Kim spent the intervening hours in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of bad coffee she couldn't afford and watching the staff come and go. And when the clock finally showed 2 in the afternoon, she made her way to the pediatrics wing and asked a nurse if she could speak with Dr. Marsh about a private matter. The nurse gave her a curious look but went to fetch the doctor, and a few minutes later, a woman emerged from one of the examination rooms, a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a white coat over practical slacks and a blue blouse, her face lined with the kind of tired kindness that came from decades of caring for sick children. Kim stood as Dr. Marsh approached, and she said simply, because there was no other way to say it, "My name is Kim Chen, and I need to talk to you about Rosie." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The doctor's professional composure cracking like glass under pressure, her face going pale, her hand reaching out to grip the wall for support, and she stared at Kim with eyes that were suddenly bright with unshed tears. Without a word, Dr. Marsh led Kim to a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, far from the other tables, and they sat across from each other with untouched cups of coffee between them. And the doctor said in a voice that shook with emotion, "You're her daughter, you look just like her. I should have known the moment I saw you." For the next hour, Dr. Ellen Marsh told Kim everything, and with each word, Kim felt the weight of her mother's story settling more heavily on her shoulders. Dr. Marsh had been a young pediatrician in the late 1992 when she began to notice the cluster of childhood cancers in Millbrook, cases that appeared with a frequency that defied medical explanation. And she had done what any ethical doctor would do. She had documented everything, compiled statistics, and reported her concerns to the hospital administration and the county health department. But instead of launching an investigation, the hospital had buried her report, and the health department had dismissed her findings as statistical anomaly. It was Rosie who had believed her. Rosie who had reached out after reading a small article Dr. Marsh had managed to get published in a medical journal, and together they had built the case that should have brought Clearwater Industries to its knees. Dr. Marsh gave Rosie copies of everything, all her medical findings, all her data, and Rosie was going to drive to the state capitol on the 17th of August 2003 to deliver it personally to the EPA regional office. But on August 14, 3 days before that trip, Rosie disappeared, and her car was found 2 days later submerged in Miller's River 30 miles outside of town, and the official ruling was accidental drowning, case closed. Dr. Marsh's voice broke as she described what happened next, how hospital administrators had called her into a closed-door meeting and made it clear that if she continued to pursue her concerns about Clearwater Industries, she would lose her medical license on manufactured ethics violations, and how she had chosen silence over professional suicide, had chosen to keep her ability to help the children she could still help rather than sacrifice everything for a truth no one wanted to hear. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 18 years, Dr. Marsh whispered, tears now streaming down her face. And I've hated myself for being a coward, for letting Rosie die alone, for letting those children's deaths go unanswered. And now you're here, and you're her daughter, and God help me, I don't know if I'm relieved or terrified. Dr. Marsh scribbled an address on a napkin before they parted, her handwriting as shaky as her voice, explaining that there was an independent environmental testing laboratory in the city, a place that had no ties to Millbrook or its poisoned economy, and she made Kim promise to be careful, to trust no one in town, to remember that Rosie had died because she had underestimated how far these people would go to protect their interests. Kim left the hospital with the napkin clutched in her hand, and a sense of purpose burning in her chest that was stronger than her fear. And she returned to the diner with renewed determination, knowing exactly what she needed to do. Behind the diner, beyond the weedy parking lot and the rusted dumpster, ran the creek that Dr. Marsh had mentioned, a narrow stream that wound its way down from the hills, passing directly through the property where Clearwater Industries squatted like a malignant tumor on the landscape. Kim followed the creek's banks with Mercy at her side, the dog now her constant shadow, and she used empty glass jars she had found in the diner's kitchen to collect samples from multiple points along the water's path, her hands turning numb in the cold current, her heart racing every time she heard a car on the distant highway. The water looked clear enough in the jars, almost innocent, but Kim imagined she could see the poison in it, the invisible death that had been flowing through this town for decades, seeping into wells and gardens and the bodies of children who had no choice but to drink what they were given. Back in the hidden basement room, she discovered that Rosie had been even more thorough than she had initially realized, finding a small refrigeration unit in the corner, still miraculously functional, containing dozens of water samples that Rosie had collected and preserved, each one labeled with a date and location, some going back to 1998. Kim carefully packaged everything, the new samples and the old, wrapping each jar in newspaper and placing them in a sturdy box, and she addressed the package to the lab using a fake name she made up on the spot, paying for the shipping with cash at a post office 2 towns over where no one would recognize her. The return to the diner felt different now, felt exposed and vulnerable, and Kim began to notice things that had been happening all along but that her grief and confusion had prevented her from seeing clearly. The same dark blue sedan passed by the diner 3 times in a single afternoon, slowing each time as if the driver were studying the building, taking notes, reporting back to someone. A white van with no markings parked across the highway for hours, and though Kim could not see through its tinted windows, she felt the weight of eyes on her, felt the attention like a physical pressure against her skin. Mercy sensed it too, the dog staying close to Kim's side at all times now, her body tense and alert, her ears constantly swiveling to track sounds that Kim could not hear. And at night, Mercy would not sleep but instead positioned herself at the office window, watching the darkness with an intensity that spoke of her own traumatic past, her own understanding of human cruelty. Kim tried to convince herself that she was being paranoid, that the stress and the revelations of the past few days were making her see threats where none existed. But when she went into town to buy more food and noticed the same two men in the hardware store that she had seen at the gas station, and then again at the grocery store, both of them watching her with an attention that was far too focused to be coincidental, she knew with cold certainty that Dr. Marsh's warnings had been justified, that she was being watched, that someone knew she was Rosie's daughter, and that her life was now in as much danger as her mother's had been. Kim had given the laboratory her email address, a free account she had set up years ago at the orphanage and rarely used, and for 3 days she checked it obsessively, refreshing the page dozens of times each hour, her anxiety growing with each moment of silence, wondering if the samples had been lost or if the lab had decided the case was too dangerous to touch. On the 4th day, as gray afternoon light filtered through the office window and Mercy dozed fitfully at her feet, the email arrived, and Kim's hands shook so badly she could barely click on the attachment. A PDF file that opened to reveal page after page of technical data and chemical analysis that she struggled at first to understand. But the cover letter from the lab technician, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kemper, was written in plain English that left no room for misunderstanding. And as Kim read those words, she felt the floor drop away beneath her, felt the full horrifying weight of what her mother had discovered and what had been allowed to continue for nearly 2 decades. The water samples, both Rosie's preserved specimens from 1998 through 2003 and Kim's fresh collections from last week, showed catastrophic levels of contamination that Dr. Kemper described as among the worst environmental poisoning cases I have encountered in 20 years of testing. The list of compounds read like a catalog of industrial death. Trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, solvents used in metal degreasing that were known carcinogens, benzene and toluene from petroleum processing, lead and mercury at concentrations hundreds of times above safe drinking water standards, and a dozen other chemicals with names Kim could barely pronounce but whose toxic effects were meticulously documented. What made the results even more damning was the comparison between old and new, the irrefutable evidence that not only had the contamination been severe in Rosie's time, but it had actually worsened over the intervening years, the concentrations climbing steadily as Clearwater Industries continued its operations unchecked, dumping its poison into the creek with the confidence of a company that knew it would never face consequences. Dr. Kemper's note at the bottom of the report was brief but carried the weight of professional outrage. These levels should have triggered a mandatory federal investigation decades ago under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. The fact that no such investigation occurred, that these conditions have been allowed to persist and worsen, suggests a systematic failure of regulatory oversight that can only be explained by deliberate suppression of evidence. Someone with considerable power has been hiding this, and I strongly recommend you contact the EPA Office of Inspector General immediately. I am keeping copies of these results in a secure location, as I believe this data represents evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Kim read the email 3 times, her vision blurring with tears of rage and grief. Understanding now with perfect clarity why her mother had died, why Rosie had been willing to sacrifice everything including her own child to try to stop this. Every day that Clearwater Industries operated, every day that contaminated water flowed through Millbrook, children were being poisoned, families were being destroyed, and the people responsible were not just getting away with it but profiting from it, protected by a web of corruption that extended from the factory floor to the sheriff's office and perhaps beyond. Kim looked around the small office that had become her home, at the hidden basement below with its files and photographs and red string connecting the dead, and she knew with absolute certainty that if those files were destroyed, if this building burned or was bulldozed or simply vanished like so many inconvenient truths, then her mother's death would mean nothing, and the children would keep dying. She needed to digitize everything, needed to create copies that could not be destroyed, needed to transform Rosie's physical evidence into data that could live in multiple places at once, impossible to silence with a single match or a midnight visit from men with crowbars and gasoline. Kim was in the basement room the next morning, using her phone to photograph page after page of Rosie's documents, when Mercy began barking upstairs, not the alarm bark of threat but a lower, more uncertain sound, and Kim climbed the stairs to find an expensive black Mercedes sedan parked in front of the diner, its paint gleaming in the weak sunlight like polished obsidian. The man who stepped out of the car was everything the vehicle suggested he would be. tall and fit in his late 40s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Kim had spent on everything in her entire life. His silver-threaded dark hair styled with casual perfection, his face handsome in a way that seemed manufactured, all smooth planes and practiced expressions. He walked to the front door with the confident stride of someone who had never been denied anything, and when Kim opened it with Mercy growling softly at her side, he extended his hand and smiled with perfectly white teeth that somehow made him look more predatory rather than less. He introduced himself as Robert Harding, Vice President of Operations for Clearwater Industries, and his voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, warm and friendly in a way that felt calculated down to the precise tone and inflection. He asked if he might come in for just a moment to discuss a business proposition, and Kim, knowing that refusing would only delay the inevitable, stepped aside and let him enter, watching as his eyes swept the interior of the diner with an assessment that was far too thorough to be casual curiosity. Harding moved to one of the booths and sat with easy familiarity, as if he owned the place already, and he gestured for Kim to sit across from him, his smile never wavering, never reaching his cold gray eyes. He began with pleasantries, commenting on how difficult it must be for a young woman alone to take on a property in such poor condition, expressing sympathy for her years in the orphanage, somehow knowing details about her life that he should not have known, and Kim felt her skin crawl with the realization that these people had been researching her, building a file, preparing for this moment. Then Harding got to the point, leaning forward slightly, his hands folded on the table in a gesture that was probably meant to seem open and honest, but instead felt like a businessman closing a trap. He said that Clearwater Industries had been looking to expand their operations, that this property was in a location that would be valuable for their plans, and that he was authorized to offer Kim $250,000 in cash for the diner and the land, along with any materials or items that might have been left behind by the previous owner. He emphasized the cash aspect, the immediacy of it, the freedom it would represent for someone who had never had money, never had choices, never had the luxury of imagining a life beyond survival. He painted a picture of Kim leaving Millbrook behind, going to college, traveling, starting fresh somewhere far away where nobody knew her story or her mother's name, and his voice was so reasonable, so persuasive, that for a moment Kim almost wavered, almost let herself imagine taking that money and running. But then she looked at Mercy, at the dog who had been abandoned and chained and left to die, and she thought of the children in the photographs downstairs, their innocent faces smiling in school pictures taken just before the poison in their water began destroying them from the inside. And she said clearly, and without hesitation, "No, this place isn't for sale." Harding's smile finally disappeared, the mask slipping to reveal something hard and ugly beneath, and he leaned back in the booth, his posture shifting from friendly to threatening in an instant. He said softly, almost conversationally, that it would be such a terrible shame if something were to happen to this old building. These wooden structures were notorious fire hazards. So many of them burned down every year through unfortunate accidents, and it would be even more tragic if Kim were to have some kind of accident herself, perhaps like her mother, a sad drowning or a fall or any number of misfortunes that seemed to befall people who didn't know when to accept a generous offer. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the door, pausing to look back at Kim with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only cold calculation, and he said, "You have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, we'll handle this situation in whatever way becomes necessary." Kim spent the hours after Harding's visit in a state of barely controlled panic, moving through the diner like a caged animal, checking the windows obsessively, jumping at every sound, knowing that the 24-hour deadline was not a real offer but a psychological weapon designed to break her will. She was considering her options, none of them good, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and she answered with her heart hammering, expecting another threat, but instead heard Dr. Marsh's voice, tight with urgency, saying, "There's someone you need to meet, someone who might be able to help. His name is Marcus Webb, and he's a journalist. I'm giving him your number. Please talk to him." 10 minutes later, Marcus called, and his voice was young and earnest, maybe early 30s, and he explained that he had been investigating Clearwater Industries for the past 6 months, as part of a larger series on corporate pollution in rural America, that Dr. Marsh had contacted him after Kim's visit and told him there might be evidence that could break his story wide open. Kim was cautious, remembering her mother's letter, remembering the warning to trust no one, and she told Marcus that she would need to meet him in person before she showed him anything. And they agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a town 30 miles away, neutral territory where neither of them would be recognized. The next morning, Kim drove her mother's investigation to that meeting in a backpack, leaving Mercy locked safely in the diner's office, and she found Marcus waiting in a corner booth, a thin man with dark curly hair, glasses, and the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent more time chasing stories than sleeping. He had a laptop, a recorder, and a notepad covered in cramped handwriting, and his eyes were sharp with intelligence and a hunger for truth that Kim recognized because she felt it in herself. He was skeptical at first, admitting that he had heard countless conspiracy theories from well-meaning people who saw patterns where none existed, and he needed to see actual evidence before he could take this seriously. Kim opened the backpack and began laying documents on the table between them, the lab reports from Dr. Kemper showing the catastrophic contamination levels, Rosie's meticulously documented case files on the sick children, the water sample records spanning years, the photographs of the families whose lives had been destroyed, and finally, the letter her mother had written to her unborn daughter. She watched Marcus's face as he read, saw the skepticism drain away and be replaced by something harder, something that looked like controlled fury, and when he looked up at her, his voice was shaking slightly as he said, "This is real, this is all real, and it's worse than I thought." He explained that Clearwater Industries was not an independent company but a subsidiary of Titan Group, a massive multinational conglomerate, with revenue in the billions and political connections that reached into state capitals and Congress itself. Marcus had been tracking Titan's operations across the country, documenting a pattern of environmental crimes that had been systematically buried through a combination of legal intimidation, political pressure, and strategic payoffs to local officials. He told Kim about 3 other towns in 3 other states where similar contamination had occurred, where similar activists had tried to speak out, and where those activists had met with unfortunate accidents or sudden financial ruin or criminal charges that appeared from nowhere and destroyed their credibility. He looked at Kim with eyes that held both determination and fear, and he said, "If we do this, if we go public with this evidence, they will come after both of us with everything they have. And these people have more resources and fewer scruples than you can possibly imagine. But if we don't do this, if we let them win again, then your mother died for nothing and the children will keep dying." Marcus arrived at the diner that evening with equipment he had borrowed from the newspaper, a professional-grade scanner, 2 external hard drives, a laptop with encryption software, and enough determination to sustain them through what they both knew would be exhausting, dangerous work. They began after dark, descending into the hidden basement with Mercy taking up her post at the top of the stairs, her body a living alarm system that would alert them to any approach long before human ears could detect it. The work was painstaking and meticulous. Each document had to be carefully removed from its folder, flattened if it had curled with age, scanned at high resolution to capture every detail, including handwritten notes in margins and faded stamps on official letterhead, and then returned to its precise location in Rosie's filing system. Kim handled the papers with reverence, as if they were holy relics, and in a way they were, each one representing a piece of her mother's soul, hours of investigation and courage distilled into ink on paper. Marcus worked with professional efficiency, but even he could not hide his growing amazement at the scope of what they were uncovering, the sheer thoroughness of Rosie's investigation that went far beyond what either of them had initially understood. On the second night, they found a file labeled Witness Statement that contained a notarized testimony from a man named James Holloway, a former maintenance worker at Clearwater Industries who had witnessed the illegal dumping of chemical waste directly into the creek under cover of darkness, describing in precise detail the drums of toxic sludge that were loaded onto trucks twice a week and driven to remote access points where they were simply poured into the water. And Holloway had included photographs he had taken with a disposable camera, grainy but unmistakable images of men in Clearwater uniforms dumping barrels into the stream. The financial records folder was even more explosive, containing bank statements and canceled checks that showed systematic payoffs to local officials, including Sheriff Bridger, who had received monthly deposits of $2,000 for nearly 15 years, and the mayor and 3 county commissioners, and even the director of the regional EPA office, all of them bought and paid for with money that could be traced directly back to Titan Group's slush fund accounts. The falsified EPA compliance reports filled an entire drawer, showing side-by-side comparisons between the real testing data from Clearwater's operations and the sanitized versions that had been submitted to regulators, the discrepancies so blatant that they could only represent deliberate fraud at the highest levels of the company. They worked through the nights and into the gray pre-dawn hours, scanning and encrypting and backing up, creating multiple copies that Marcus stored in different locations, one at his apartment in the city, one in a safety deposit box at a bank 2 counties away, and one uploaded to a secure cloud server that would automatically release the files to major news organizations if Marcus failed to check in every 72 hours. Kim felt her mother's presence in that basement room more strongly with each passing hour, felt as if Rosie were standing beside her, guiding her hands, whispering encouragement in a voice Kim had never heard but somehow knew in her bones, and she found herself talking to that ghost, promising that the work would be finished, that the truth would finally be told, that the children's deaths would not remain unanswered. They had been working for 3 days, barely sleeping, subsisting on coffee and granola bars, when Sheriff Bridger returned, and this time he was not alone. Kim heard the vehicles pull up just after noon on the 4th day, 2 of them, the sheriff's cruiser and a white county truck, and Mercy's growl was immediate and deep, a sound that raised the hair on the back of Kim's neck. She emerged from the basement where she and Marcus had been finishing the last of the scanning, pulling the trapdoor closed behind her, and she met Bridger and his companion at the front door before they could knock. The sheriff had abandoned his folksy, friendly demeanor, his face now set in hard lines of barely concealed hostility, and the man with him was introduced as Gerald Kepler, county building inspector, a small, officious man with a clipboard and an expression of smug authority. Bridger announced that they had received multiple complaints about health code violations and structural safety issues at the property, that an immediate inspection was required, and that Kim needed to grant them access to all areas of the building right now, or face criminal charges for obstruction. Kim felt ice water flood her veins, felt the trap closing around her just as it had closed around her mother 18 years ago. But she had read Rosie's journals, had seen the exact same tactics documented in painful detail, the manufactured violations, the sudden appearance of inspectors with predetermined conclusions, the systematic harassment designed to make fighting back more expensive and exhausting than surrender. She stood in the doorway, blocking their entry, and she said in a voice that was calmer than she felt, "I'm aware of my rights as a property owner, and I'm not granting access to my building without proper notice and without my legal representative present." It was a complete bluff. She had no lawyer, had no money to hire one, but Bridger and Kepler didn't know that, and she saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. Kepler recovered first, his voice rising with indignation as he launched into a litany of supposed violations, claiming that the structure was unsafe, that there were code violations dating back decades, that the building posed a danger to public health and could be condemned immediately without further inspection. He stepped forward, trying to push past Kim, and that was when Mercy moved, the dog flowing like liquid muscle to position herself squarely between Kim and the 2 men. Her lips pulled back to expose teeth that looked designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. A low, continuous growl vibrating in her chest that promised violence if they took one more step. Kepler stumbled backward, his clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield, and Bridger's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Kim said sharply, "She's protecting her home, which is her right, and if you shoot a dog for defending her owner on private property, I guarantee that will be documented and reported." The standoff lasted for several long seconds, the tension thick enough to choke on, and then Bridger seemed to make a calculation, seemed to decide that forcing the issue now would create more problems than it solved. He stepped back, his face flushed with anger, and he said to Kepler, "We'll come back with the proper paperwork and law enforcement backup if necessary." But before he left, he turned to Kim, and his eyes were cold and dead as a snake's. And he said in a voice that carried the weight of personal knowledge and barely concealed threat, "Your mother didn't know when to quit either, and we all know how that turned out for her." Kim had left Mercy locked in the back office with water and food, needing to make a quick trip into town for supplies because they were out of everything, and Marcus would be arriving that evening to finish uploading the final batch of documents to the secure server, and the grocery run took longer than expected because she had to walk to a store 2 miles away, not trusting the closer options where too many people had started to recognize her. She was carrying 2 bags of groceries, her arms aching, and her mind occupied with planning their next moves, when she turned the corner from Highway 41 and saw the diner, and her heart simply stopped. The front door was hanging open, splintered wood around the frame where it had been kicked in with brutal force, and even from a distance she could see that the interior was wrong, the shapes and shadows all disturbed from their familiar patterns. She dropped the grocery bags and ran, her boots pounding on the cracked asphalt, terror flooding her system as she thought of Mercy locked inside, vulnerable and alone, and she burst through the broken doorway, calling the dog's name. What she found was devastation, methodical and thorough. Every booth had been overturned, the vinyl slashed and the stuffing pulled out, the tables flipped and their legs broken off as if someone had been searching underneath them. The long counter had been swept clean, all the old menus and the register and the accumulated debris of years scattered across the floor. And the jukebox in the corner had been smashed, its glass front shattered, its internal mechanisms torn out and thrown against the wall. The kitchen was worse, every cabinet emptied, every drawer pulled out and dumped, pots and pans and decades-old utensils scattered like shrapnel from an explosion. But through all of this chaos, through all of this violation, Kim heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Mercy's frantic barking coming from the back office, muffled but strong, the sound of a living dog rather than an injured or dying one. Kim ran to the office door, which was still closed and locked exactly as she had left it, and when she opened it, Mercy burst out, whining and jumping and pressing her body against Kim's legs, terrified but completely unharmed. The office itself had not been touched, its door never opened, and Kim stood there with her arms wrapped around the trembling dog, trying to process what this meant. The intruders had ransacked the entire diner but had deliberately avoided the one room where the dog was locked, which meant they had known exactly where Mercy was, which meant someone had been watching, studying their patterns, reporting back with enough detail that the break-in could be executed without the complication of dealing with a protective German shepherd. Kim moved through the destroyed dining room with Mercy at her heels, her initial shock giving way to a cold, analytical assessment of what had happened and what it revealed. She made her way to the kitchen, to the spot near the walk-in freezer where the hidden trapdoor was concealed, and her hands shook as she knelt to examine the floor tiles. They were undisturbed, the grout lines intact, the thin layer of grime that she had deliberately left to camouflage the entrance completely untouched. They had torn apart the diner searching for Rosie's evidence, but they hadn't found it, which meant either they didn't know about the basement or they weren't certain it existed and had been hoping to discover it through brute force. Kim pulled out her phone and called Marcus, her voice shaking as she described what had happened, and he arrived within the hour, his face pale as he surveyed the damage. They stood in the ruins of the diner, and Marcus said what they were both thinking. They're getting desperate, which means they know we're close to something they can't afford to have exposed. And desperate people make mistakes, but they also become more dangerous. They agreed that it was time to contact federal authorities, but they both knew that without current, ongoing proof of contamination, without something that showed the poisoning was still happening right now, the case could be dismissed as historical, already addressed, a tragedy from the past rather than a crime in progress. They planned the operation for 2 nights later, when the moon would be only a thin crescent, and the darkness would be deepest, and Marcus would serve as lookout, positioned on a hillside half a mile away with binoculars and a burner phone, ready to call if he saw security patrols or any sign that Kim had been discovered. Kim studied Rosie's maps and notes with obsessive attention, memorizing every detail of the Clearwater Industries property, the locations of the security cameras, the patrol routes that her mother had documented years ago, and most importantly, the drainage pipes where the illegal dumping occurred, hidden access points on the eastern edge of the property where the land sloped down toward the creek and the tree cover was thick enough to provide concealment. She dressed in dark clothes, filled a backpack with empty sample jars, a camera, gloves, and a flashlight she would use only in absolute emergency. And she brought Mercy because the dog's senses were far superior to her own, and because leaving her behind felt like abandoning a partner. They approached the Clearwater property through the woods just after midnight, moving slowly and carefully, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot in the profound silence of the rural night, and Kim's heart hammered so hard in her chest that she was certain it could be heard for miles. The fence was chain-link topped with barbed wire, but Rosie's notes had marked a section where the ground dipped and erosion had created a gap large enough to crawl through, and Kim found it exactly where the map indicated, and she and Mercy slipped beneath the fence and into the territory of the enemy. The factory loomed in the distance, a dark angular mass against the stars, its windows lit with the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lights, and Kim moved toward the eastern drainage area, staying low, using the scattered equipment and storage tanks as cover. She found the pipes exactly as Rosie had described them, large concrete culverts set into the hillside, and even in the darkness she could see the dark stains on the ground around them, could smell the acrid chemical stench that burned her nostrils and made her eyes water. She pulled on the gloves and began collecting samples, filling jar after jar with the toxic sludge that was actively flowing from the pipes, a slow, steady stream of poison being released directly into the creek that fed Millbrook's water supply. And she used her phone to photograph everything: the pipes, the stains, the Clearwater Industries logos on the nearby buildings, and the barrels stacked beside a maintenance shed, each one marked with hazardous material symbols and warning labels that made it clear these were not legal waste products but industrial poisons that should have been disposed of through proper channels. The work took 20 minutes, 20 minutes of pure terror during which every sound made her freeze, every shadow seemed to hide a security guard, and her hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped one of the sample jars. She was sealing the final jar when Mercy's body went rigid, a low growl beginning in her throat, and Kim looked up to see lights, 2 sets of headlights, approaching from the main facility. Security vehicles on their patrol route, and they were going to pass within 100 yards of where she crouched. Kim grabbed the backpack and ran, not toward the fence they had entered through, but toward a secondary exit point Rosie had marked as emergency egress only, a section where the fence bordered a steep ravine and the barbed wire had rusted away. Mercy ran beside her, silent now, understanding the need for stealth, and behind them Kim could hear voices, shouts. The security patrol had seen something, or their motion had triggered a sensor. She reached the fence, threw the backpack over, and squeezed through a gap that tore her jacket and scraped her skin raw, and Mercy followed, and they tumbled down the ravine on the other side, sliding through loose dirt and dead leaves, branches whipping at their faces. They ran through the woods for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and they didn't stop until they reached Marcus's car, hidden on a logging road 2 miles away. And only then did Kim let herself collapse against the door, gasping for air, clutching the backpack full of evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that the poisoning was still happening, that every day of delay meant more children drinking death from their taps, and that her mother had been right about everything. Marcus had driven to the city the day after their night operation at Clearwater Industries, taking 1 set of the backup drives to upload to a secure server at his newspaper's office, and he had called Kim that afternoon to tell her that everything was safely stored and that he was heading back, that they should meet tomorrow to plan their approach to the FBI. But Marcus never arrived at the diner that evening, and when Kim tried calling him, his phone went straight to voicemail, and a cold dread settled in her stomach that grew heavier with each passing hour of silence. The call came at 11 that night from a nurse at County General Hospital, asking if Kim was a relative of Marcus Webb, and when Kim said she was a close friend, the nurse explained in the carefully neutral tone that medical professionals used to deliver bad news that Marcus had been in a serious car accident and was asking for her. Kim left immediately, taking Mercy with her because she no longer felt safe leaving the dog alone, and she drove the 40 minutes to the hospital with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles went white, her mind conjuring images of twisted metal and broken bodies. She found Marcus in a private room, his head wrapped in bandages, his face bruised and swollen almost beyond recognition, his torso wrapped in tape to stabilize 3 broken ribs, and when he saw her, he tried to smile, but the effort made him wince with pain. He told her what had happened in a voice made hoarse by the breathing tube they had removed an hour earlier, how he had been driving back on the highway when a dark SUV had pulled alongside him, then deliberately swerved into his lane, forcing him off the road and down an embankment, and how 2 men had climbed down to his wrecked car before emergency services arrived, and they had stolen his laptop, the one with backup copies of Rosie's evidence, ripping it from the passenger seat where it had been stored. Marcus gripped Kim's hand with surprising strength for someone so injured, and he said that this proved they were close to something massive, that corporations didn't attack journalists and risk federal charges unless they were absolutely desperate, unless the truth they were trying to hide was worth any risk to suppress. He urged Kim to go to the FBI immediately, to take everything they had and put it in the hands of federal authorities, who would have the resources and the jurisdiction to protect her, and to bring down not just Clearwater Industries, but the entire corrupt network that had enabled it. But Kim was paralyzed by fear and doubt, torn between her desire for justice and the overwhelming terror that she was going to end up like Marcus, or worse, like her mother. A body in a river with a death certificate that read, "Accidental." She stayed with Marcus until visiting hours ended, promising she would think about it, promising she would be careful. And she drove back to the diner through the dark, empty roads, with Mercy's warm presence in the passenger seat, the only thing keeping her panic at bay. She had just pulled into the diner's parking lot, had just stepped out of the car when she heard the sound of breaking glass, a sharp explosive crash from inside the building, and she ran to find that the front window, the large plate glass window that had somehow survived decades of abandonment, had been shattered by a brick that now lay on the floor, surrounded by glittering shards. Tied to the brick with twine was a piece of paper, and Kim picked it up with shaking hands and read the message written in block letters with black marker, words that carried the weight of a death sentence. Last warning, sell and leave, or end up like Rosie. Kim spent the night after the brick came through her window sitting on the floor of the office with her back against the wall and her mother's letter clutched in her hands, reading it over and over by the light of her phone while Mercy lay across her lap like a living blanket. And by the time dawn broke gray and cold through the shattered window, she had made her decision. She could not do this alone, could not fight a corporation with unlimited resources and no conscience, could not risk ending up as another convenient accident that would be forgotten by everyone except the people who had caused it, and more importantly, she could not let her fear dishonor her mother's courage or betray the children who had died waiting for someone to care enough to act. She found the number for the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division on their website, and at 9 in the morning, when she assumed federal offices would be open, she called from the burner phone Marcus had given her for emergencies, her hands shaking so badly she had to dial 3 times before getting it right. The receptionist who answered was professionally polite but clearly accustomed to screening calls from people who thought every local environmental issue was a federal case, and Kim was transferred twice before finally reaching someone who identified herself as Special Agent Sarah Voss. The agent's voice was businesslike and slightly weary, carrying the tone of someone who had heard countless conspiracy theories from well-meaning citizens who saw corporate malfeasance in every closed factory and contaminated stream. And she listened with what sounded like patient skepticism as Kim began to explain about Rosie Chen and Clearwater Industries and the children who had died. Kim could hear the doubt in the long pauses, could sense that Agent Voss was mentally categorizing this as another dead end that would waste her time, and she knew she had only seconds before the agent would politely end the call and move on to more credible cases. So Kim said the 2 words that changed everything, the 2 words that made Agent Voss go silent on the other end of the line, and those words were Titan Group. The transformation in the agent's demeanor was immediate and profound, her voice sharpening with sudden intense focus as she asked Kim to repeat what she had just said, to explain exactly how Titan Group was connected to this case, and Kim, sensing that she had finally found someone who would listen, someone who understood the scope of what she was dealing with, began to tell the whole story from the beginning. She described finding the key to the diner, discovering the hidden basement, her mother's investigation, the water samples both old and new, the medical records, the financial documents showing payoffs to local officials, and the fresh evidence she had collected from the drainage pipes showing that the contamination was ongoing and active. Agent Voss asked her to send digital copies of selected documents immediately, and Kim used her phone to photograph several of the most damning pieces, including Dr. Kemper's lab analysis and the testimony from the Clearwater employee, and she sent them to the secure email address the agent provided. There was a long silence on the line as Voss reviewed the images, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed completely, all traces of skepticism replaced by barely controlled intensity. She told Kim something that made the entire nightmare suddenly make terrible sense. The FBI had been building a case against Titan Group for nearly 3 years, following a trail of environmental crimes across multiple states, but they had been stymied at every turn by the company's lawyers, by political pressure from officials in Titan's pocket, and most critically, by the lack of hard evidence showing ongoing criminal activity rather than historical violations that could be dismissed as already remedied. What Kim had, what Rosie had died to collect, was exactly what the FBI needed to break the case open, to prove that Titan's crimes were not isolated incidents from the past, but part of a continuing criminal enterprise that was still actively poisoning communities. Agent Voss explained that Rosie's documentation provided the historical pattern, and Kim's fresh samples from the drainage pipes provided proof that nothing had changed, that the same crimes were being committed today under the noses of regulators who had been corrupted or intimidated into silence. But then Voss's voice took on a tone of urgent concern, and she said something that made Kim's blood run cold. Kim was in immediate and serious danger, the kind of danger that required federal protection. Because Titan Group had demonstrated in other cases that they would go to extraordinary lengths to silence witnesses, and the fact that they had already attacked Marcus meant they had abandoned any pretense of restraint. Voss told Kim that she needed to leave the diner immediately, needed to get somewhere public and stay there, and that agents would be dispatched to her location within hours to take her into protective custody and to secure the evidence before it could be destroyed. Agent Voss made the arrangements within 2 hours, her efficiency a testament to how seriously the FBI was taking the case, and she instructed Kim to pack only essentials and to bring every piece of original evidence from the basement, every document and photograph and water sample that Rosie had preserved, because federal agents would be securing the diner property, but they could not risk leaving anything behind that might be destroyed before the chain of custody could be established. Kim worked with frantic speed, loading everything into boxes and bags, her hands moving mechanically while her mind struggled with the feeling that she was abandoning her mother's home, betraying the place where Rosie had spent her final days fighting a battle that had ultimately killed her. The diner had become more than just a building in the past weeks. It had become a shrine, a connection to the mother Kim had never known, and leaving it felt like cutting the last thread that bound them together across the chasm of death and lost years. She locked the front door one final time, the rusted key heavy in her palm, and she stood in the parking lot looking at the sagging roof and the boarded windows and the faded signs swaying in the cold wind, and she whispered an apology to the ghost she felt watching from within those walls. Agent Voss had arranged for Kim and Mercy to stay at a small roadside motel called the Pine Rest, located 2 towns over in a place called Hadley, that was anonymous enough to provide concealment but close enough that FBI agents could reach her quickly if needed. The room was small and shabby, smelling of old carpet and industrial cleaner, with 2 beds covered in faded floral bedspreads, and a television that only received 3 channels, but it had a lock on the door and curtains on the windows, and that was all that mattered. Kim checked in under the name Sarah Miller, a generic alias that Agent Voss had provided, paying cash for 3 nights in advance, and the desk clerk barely looked at her, too absorbed in a game show playing on a small television behind the counter to care about another transient guest passing through. Kim spent the first day organizing the evidence, laying it all out on one of the beds, photographing everything again as backup in case something happened to the originals, and uploading the images to the encrypted server that Agent Voss had given her access to. Marcus called her that afternoon from his hospital bed, his voice stronger now though still strained with pain, and he told her that she had done the right thing, that Rosie would be proud of her for choosing survival over martyrdom, that staying alive to see justice done was the only way to honor her mother's sacrifice. He reminded her that Rosie had hidden Kim at the orphanage for exactly this reason, to keep her safe so that one day she might finish the work that Rosie had started, and that throwing her life away in a futile last stand at the diner would have made that sacrifice meaningless. His words helped, but they could not entirely dispel the guilt that sat like a stone in Kim's chest, the feeling that she had run away, that she was hiding while Rosie's killers walked free and confident. The second day passed in agonizing slowness, Kim pacing the small room like a caged animal while Mercy watched her with concerned amber eyes, and Agent Voss called twice to update her on the investigation's progress, explaining that they were building the case methodically, that federal warrants took time to secure, that they needed to coordinate with multiple agencies to ensure that when they moved against Titan Group, the net would be wide enough to catch everyone involved. The third day was worse, the waiting becoming almost unbearable, and Kim sat on the bed staring at the evidence spread around her, at the photographs of dead children and her mother's handwritten notes, and she felt the walls of the motel room closing in, felt the isolation becoming a physical weight that pressed down on her shoulders. She was considering calling Agent Voss to ask if there was any news when her phone rang, the screen showing unknown number in cold digital letters, and Kim answered without thinking, expecting perhaps a wrong number or a telemarketer. Instead, she heard a voice she recognized, smooth and cold as polished steel, the voice of Robert Harding, and he said with casual certainty that chilled her to the bone, "Hello, Kim. I hope you're comfortable at the Pine Rest Motel, room 107, I believe. Such a charming little place. We should talk about your situation before you make any more mistakes that you'll regret." Kim's hand went numb, the phone nearly slipping from her grip. And she looked toward the window with its thin curtains that suddenly seemed utterly inadequate, and she realized with terrible clarity that the safe house was not safe, that somehow they had found her, that there was a leak either in local law enforcement or perhaps even within the federal system itself, and that she was trapped in a room that had just transformed from sanctuary to prison. Kim ended the call immediately, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand how they had found her when only Agent Voss and Marcus knew where she was. And the terrible answer settled over her like ice water, cold and undeniable. There had to be a leak, someone feeding information to Clearwater Industries, someone with access to federal communications or local law enforcement channels, someone who was still loyal to the money rather than the law. She could not trust the local police, that much had been clear from the beginning. Sheriff Bridger was on Clearwater's payroll, according to Rosie's financial records, but now she could not even be certain that the federal system was secure, could not know if Agent Voss herself was compromised, or if someone else in the FBI office was passing information to Titan Group's lawyers. The only people she could trust with absolute certainty were Marcus, who had nearly died for this story, and Agent Voss, who had 3 years invested in bringing down Titan, and whose voice had carried genuine conviction when she spoke about justice. Kim gathered the evidence boxes with shaking hands, her mind racing through options that all seemed equally hopeless, and she called Agent Voss on the secure line, speaking quickly and quietly, explaining about Harding's call, about the leak, about the fact that her location had been discovered. Agent Voss's response was immediate and sharp, her professional calm cracking to reveal genuine alarm as she told Kim to get out of the motel immediately, to take the evidence and run, and that she would have agents there within 30 minutes, but that might not be fast enough. Kim ended the call and looked at Mercy, who was already standing by the door, sensing the danger, and she grabbed her backpack and the most critical documents, leaving the rest because there was no time to carry everything, and she moved toward the door before stopping herself, realizing that the front was where they would be watching, where they would expect her to go. Instead, she went to the bathroom, a cramped space with a small window that looked out over the back of the motel toward a line of trees that marked the edge of a forest, and she pushed the window open, the old frame resisting before finally giving way with a screech of metal on metal. She boosted Mercy through first, the dog squirming through the narrow opening and dropping to the ground outside, and then Kim followed, scraping her shoulders and hips on the frame, landing hard on frozen ground that knocked the wind from her lungs. She had barely gotten to her feet when she saw the headlights, 2 sets of them, turning into the motel parking lot from the highway, moving slowly like predators stalking prey, and she did not wait to see who emerged from those vehicles. She ran toward the trees with Mercy at her side, the winter air biting at her face and hands, her breath coming in visible clouds, and she realized with growing horror that she had no coat, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on her back and a backpack with a few documents and her phone. The temperature was dropping fast, the clear night sky promising a hard freeze, and she was running into wilderness with no destination and no plan except the desperate animal need to survive. Mercy seemed to understand the urgency better than Kim did, the dog taking the lead, choosing paths through the forest with an instinct that Kim could only trust and follow, and they moved deeper into the darkness while behind them she could hear shouts and the sound of car doors slamming and engines revving. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before Mercy stopped at the edge of a clearing where an old barn stood, its roof sagging and its walls listing to one side, a structure that had been abandoned long enough to be forgotten. Kim and Mercy slipped inside through a gap in the boards, finding themselves in a space that smelled of rotted hay and animal ghosts. And they huddled together in the deepest corner while the sound of vehicles searching the area grew louder and then slowly faded. Kim pulled out the burner phone Marcus had given her weeks ago for exactly this kind of emergency, and with fingers that were already going numb from the cold, she typed a message to Agent Voss that contained only 4 words but said everything that needed to be said. Compromised. They're hunting me. Kim and Mercy survived the night in that abandoned barn by huddling together for warmth. The dog's body heat, the only thing that kept Kim from succumbing to hypothermia as the temperature dropped below freezing and frost formed on the broken windows, and when dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, Kim made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal, and she would not know which until it was too late to change course. She was going back to the diner, back to the one place in the world that was truly hers, because running had accomplished nothing except to make her more vulnerable, more isolated, and she realized that Harding and his people had power only in darkness, only when their actions could be hidden and denied, and the way to fight them was not to hide but to drag everything into the light. She and Mercy made their way through the woods, moving parallel to the highway but staying concealed in the trees, and they approached the diner from the back, from the same direction Kim had used to escape from Clearwater's property that night a week ago that felt like a lifetime. The building looked exactly as she had left it, abandoned and desolate, and she used her key to enter through the back door, moving quickly to the storage room where she found an old wooden baseball bat. Its surface scarred and aged but still solid, and she gripped it with both hands, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it, knowing that she might actually have to use it to defend her life. She positioned herself in the main dining room with Mercy at her side, both of them watching the road through the broken front window, and she called Marcus on the burner phone, waking him from the pain medication-induced sleep, and she told him where she was and what she was planning. And Marcus, despite his injuries, despite the very reasonable fear that should have made him tell her she was insane, instead said he understood and that he would make some calls. The vehicles arrived just after 10 in the morning, exactly as Kim had known they would, because these people were nothing if not predictable in their arrogance and their certainty that they had already won. Robert Harding's black Mercedes led the convoy, followed by Sheriff Bridger's cruiser and a third vehicle, a dark SUV that disgorged two men in civilian clothes, who moved with the efficient menace of professional security contractors, the kind of people who did violence for money and slept perfectly well afterward. They approached the diner with casual confidence, clearly not expecting Kim to be there, and Kim watched them through the window, her heart hammering but her hands steady on the baseball bat. And at the exact moment that Harding's polished shoe touched the bottom step of the porch, she called Agent Voss on her regular phone, put it on speaker mode with the volume turned up as high as it would go, and she shouted through the broken window in a voice that carried across the parking lot. "The FBI is listening to everything you say and do right now. This conversation is being recorded, and if you touch me or this property, you will be committing federal crimes in real time." Harding froze, his face transforming from smug confidence to genuine alarm, and he spun toward his car, clearly planning to retreat before this trap could close, but it was already too late. The sound of engines filled the air, not the quiet purr of luxury vehicles, but the rumble of news vans, and they came from three directions at once, blocking the driveway and the access to the highway, and people poured out carrying cameras and microphones and the bright, aggressive lights of television journalism. Marcus had called in every favor he had contacted journalists from 3 states, had told them that the environmental story he had been investigating was about to break wide open with corporate executives and corrupt law enforcement caught on scene, and they had come like sharks sensing blood in the water. Kim watched through the window as Marcus himself emerged from one of the vans, moving slowly because of his injuries but with a determined smile on his bruised face, and he walked right up to Harding with a camera crew behind him and said loudly enough for every microphone to pick up, "Mr. Harding, Marcus Webb from the Herald, can you explain why you're at this property with armed security contractors and a sheriff who appears on your company's payroll?" The live stream had already started. Kim could see the red lights on the cameras, could see people holding up phones to record, and Harding's face went from alarm to rage to a kind of trapped desperation as he realized that everything he did from this moment forward would be documented and distributed to thousands of viewers in real time, that the darkness he operated in had been flooded with light, and that any move he made against Kim now would be captured and preserved as evidence of exactly the kind of corporate intimidation and corruption that could bring down not just him but the entire structure of protection that Titan Group had built. The video of the standoff went viral within hours, spreading across social media and news websites with the kind of momentum that could not be stopped or controlled. And by that evening, every major news organization in the country was running stories about corporate corruption and environmental crimes in rural America, using screenshots of Robert Harding's furious face and Sheriff Bridger's desperate retreat as visual proof that the powerful could be caught and exposed. Agent Voss moved with the speed and precision of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this opportunity, and within 24 hours she had secured federal warrants that were so comprehensive they covered not just Clearwater Industries, but every bank account, every property, and every communication device associated with Titan Group's operations in 3 states. The raid on Clearwater Industries began at dawn, a coordinated operation involving 40 FBI agents, environmental investigators from the EPA, and forensic accountants who descended on the facility like an occupying army, and Agent Voss personally led the team that breached the main office building. Kim watched it all unfold on television from Agent Voss's office at the FBI field headquarters, sitting in a chair that was far too comfortable for the storm of emotions raging inside her, with Mercy's warm weight pressed against her legs and Marcus beside her in a wheelchair. His broken ribs still healing, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of seeing justice finally taking physical form. The news coverage showed agents in FBI windbreakers carrying boxes of documents from the Clearwater offices, showed the drainage pipes that Kim had photographed being sealed with evidence tape, showed executives in expensive suits being led out in handcuffs, their faces carefully blank as cameras captured every moment of their humiliation. The evidence that the FBI uncovered was even more damning than what Rosie had collected, because Clearwater had continued its crimes with such arrogance that they had barely bothered to hide the proof, and the agents found falsified EPA compliance reports dating back 15 years. Financial records showing systematic bribes to local officials, including Sheriff Bridger, who had received over $300,000 since 2003, and most damning of all, internal emails and recorded phone conversations discussing what they called the Rosie Chen problem. One email in particular, sent from Robert Harding to the Titan Group's head of security in August 2003, was displayed on every news channel, its words cold and calculating as it discussed the need to arrange an accident that would silence Rosie permanently and make it clear to others in the community what happened to people who asked too many questions. Robert Harding was arrested at his home at 6 in the morning, led out in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead, and Sheriff Bridger was taken into custody at his office. And by the end of that first day, 6 other local officials had been arrested, and the CEO of Titan Group had been indicted on federal charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and Rackery-influenced corrupt organizations violations that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. Kim watched it all through tears that would not stop, her body shaking with sobs that were grief and rage and relief all tangled together into something too big to be contained. And when the news anchors spoke her mother's name, when they called Rosie Chen a hero and an activist who had died trying to protect her community, when they showed the photograph from the diner of Rosie smiling in her apron, Kim felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, felt a weight that had been pressing down on her for 18 years suddenly lift and disperse like morning fog burned away by sunlight. In the weeks that followed the arrests, as federal prosecutors built their case and journalists dug deeper into the story, more details emerged about Rosie's final months, details that Dr. Marsh had kept locked in her heart for 18 years because speaking them would have made the grief unbearable. Kim learned that her mother had discovered she was pregnant in January 2006, just as she was finalizing her plans to take the evidence to the EPA. And Rosie had been paralyzed by a terror that had nothing to do with her own safety, and everything to do with the tiny life growing inside her. Dr. Marsh explained, sitting across from Kim in the same hospital cafeteria where they had first met, that Rosie had come to her office crying, asking what she should do, because she knew that Clearwater Industries was watching her, that they had already made threats, and that a pregnant woman carrying evidence of their crimes would be seen not as a complication but as an opportunity for leverage. Rosie had made the agonizing decision to place her baby in the orphanage under a different last name, telling only Dr. Marsh and arranging everything through a lawyer in another state, hoping that by severing the visible connection between herself and her daughter, she could keep Kim safe from the people who wanted to silence her. The plan had been to expose Clearwater's crimes first, to bring in federal authorities who would provide protection, and then to reclaim her daughter and finally be the mother she desperately wanted to be. But they had killed her 3 months before Kim was born, staging the drowning before Rosie could execute her plan, and the orphanage director, a woman named Patricia Henshaw, had been paid $10,000 to keep Kim's origins hidden, to discourage any interest in the diner or questions about Rosie Chen, and to make sure that the connection between mother and daughter remained buried. Dr. Marsh's voice broke as she told Kim the last thing Rosie had ever said to her, words spoken in that final meeting before everything went dark. "If anything happens to me, my daughter will finish this. I know she will because she'll have my blood and my strength and she'll be brave enough." 6 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings and settlement negotiations and the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding, both a building and a life. Titan Group, facing criminal charges and a public relations disaster that had destroyed their stock price, agreed to a settlement that included full compensation for every family affected by the contamination, funding for a comprehensive medical monitoring program that would last for decades, and payment for the complete remediation of Millbrook's water supply. Kim received a separate settlement for the wrongful death of her mother, money she immediately put toward restoring the diner to exactly what it had been in the photographs from Rosie's time, hiring contractors who worked with old pictures to recreate every detail, from the red vinyl booths to the chrome stools to the neon sign that now glowed again against the Montana sky. The grand reopening was on a warm September afternoon, and it seemed like the entire town came. Families who had suffered and survived, people who had known Rosie and loved her, and even some who had been silent in their fear, but now could speak her name with gratitude. Dr. Marsh was there, looking lighter somehow. The weight of 18 years of guilt finally lifted, and Marcus arrived with his journalism award and a permanent job at a major newspaper that wanted him to continue investigating corporate environmental crimes. Outside the front door, mounted on a polished granite plaque, were words that Kim had chosen carefully, in memory of Rosie Chen, who asked the questions no one else would, who fought for truth when others chose silence, who saved a town. Kim stood behind the counter wearing an apron, just like her mother's, Mercy lying contentedly on a dog bed near the kitchen door. And she looked at Rosie's photograph on the wall, seeing not just a stranger anymore, but seeing herself, seeing the connection of blood and courage that had always been there waiting to be claimed. As the first customers entered and took their seats and the diner filled with voices and laughter and life, Kim smiled and said the words she had been waiting 18 years to speak. "Welcome to Rosie's."